Hey, it's good to be on with you.
Likewise. Likewise.
All right. I want to welcome those of you who are watching on the webinar we've just opened up. And our moderator, Greg Phelps, Dr. Greg Phelps is, he's not the moderator, he is the operator, and he's having a few technical issues with his sound, but we can hear each other. We hope all of you can hear. And my name is Doug Jacobs. If you checked on the website, you notice that I am retired from teaching in the church ministry and preaching areas at Southern Adventist University. And I'm really happy to have Father Brad Whitaker with us from St. Paul's Episcopal Church in downtown Chattanooga. And Brad, your church, I understand, is one of the two oldest churches in Chattanooga. When was it started?
So we were first began gathering 1858, and very soon after that, we're organized as a parish, and we're a couple of blocks over from where we are at the Easy Bistro on that corner where the Easy Bistro now is in the West Village. That's where our original church was. They built a second church building on that property, and then eventually moved just the block and a half or so over here to Pine and 7th, and have been here ever since. We're in this building is about 131 years old. So.
How long have you been there? Certainly not the 131 years.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely. 6.5 years. 6.5 years. Yeah, loving it. It was a great fit for us, and very excited to be here. Have driven back and forth through Chattanooga a lot, but never have lived in Chattanooga.
Well, I'm really delighted that you're with us today as we're talking about looking back, reflections on the pandemic, inequity, and faith. And I'm delighted to have Rabbi Kayla LaBelle with us as well. Kayla, you are brand new to Chattanooga. Tell us where you came from and how you got here.
Yes, my husband and young kids and I, we all just moved. We got here in late June, so we are fresh off the boat, so to speak. And I believe we are among hundreds of others who have made an mass exodus from wherever, many of us from California who made our way out here during or at some point during the pandemic. And my husband, Rabbi Sam Rotenberg, recently began as the solo rabbi at B'nai Zion congregation, which is their building was unfortunately too run down recently. So we had to level the building. And so we're actually renting space from Mizpah congregation, the Reform Jewish congregation on Macaulay. So we live in Appleton, but our Jewish community is in Chattanooga.
I'm really interested in the fact that you're brand new, because I think that will give a really fresh perspective as we look through the issues connected with the pandemic. Just one little thing that you mentioned there, what is the difference between Reform and conservative Judaism and Orthodox?
Yes. So, Jewish denominations are relatively young. The Reform movement only began in the 1800s, and it came about when, during the Enlightenment, when all of these discoveries were being made, and science was now part of the regular culture. There was a strong pressure among Jews, especially in Germany, to assimilate. And many of them did, and kind of as a call to kind of keep them in the Jewish fold, Reform Judaism was created to actually keep Jews part of the tradition. But Reform Judaism, classically, as it began, is a practice of Judaism in which the Jew opts into certain commandments rather than feeling obligated to all of them. And also associated with the Reform movement is a strong conviction, attachment to the prophetic tradition. Social justice is very central. Tikkun olam, the idea of healing the world, is very central for Reform Jews. But they will even go so far as to actively not observe commandments, like actively not keep kosher, or even not wear a kippah or talit, things like that. Then in response to Reform Judaism, Orthodoxy came about, because the other Jews who said, wait, hold on, what about all the mitzvot? What about all the commandments? What about traditional Judaism as we've been practicing it for thousands of years? How can you possibly just walk away from this tradition? So we have a group of people that kind of dug their heels in and created Orthodoxy. And there are many, many denominations and variations within that, that you will observe some, with different kinds of clothing, different kinds of head coverings that you may have seen before. And they are much more stringent in terms of Jewish law. And then conservative Judaism came after that as a response to both, saying, well, isn't it possible for us to live in the modern world, to believe in science, and also to feel beholden to our tradition and to be observant of the mitzvot, of the commandments? That's conservative Judaism. Conservative, not little c, or not big C political conservative, but conservative, how can we conserve the tradition even as we are awake to the modern world around us?
Well, thank you. That instructed me. I had some idea of some of that, but you've certainly helped us with that. I am really fascinated by a lot of things that both of you have been involved with, but Brad, and we'll just use first names today because it's a whole lot easier. We're just having a personal conversation here with friends. I understand that you were the first documented COVID case in Chattanooga, Hamilton County area, and you told me one of the first dozen or so in the United States. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I understand too. There was a conference I attended in February, and we got a call after having attended it, and after actually I had come back and wasn't initially feeling great, and then got sicker, but that a number of people had come down with COVID from that conference. And when I look back at the date of that, it was around February 19th, I think. There were only 12 documented cases in the whole country, and none at that point, I don't think, in the South. So it really wasn't something on radars. Certainly, the general person wasn't on radar, and I think even folks in the medical community wasn't, because my doctors, they didn't know how to test for us. They had to figure that out and call me back several hours later that day. But so yeah, it was early on. It was early on. Feels like a long time ago now.
Well, it's really interesting because I had COVID about 9 months after you contracted it. And by that time, I had already had 3 COVID tests that were all negative, just before you go on a trip or you do something. And I know that when my 4th test, when I wasn't feeling well, came back, I went down to, by the waterfront there to the testing site and had my free test. And there was a sense of not believing it when it said detected on the test. Tell me about the emotions that you went through having it. And I want to also get into the idea of what it felt like to be the very first one, what that experience was like.
Sure. Well, Kayla, I'm actually it's coming to me too that one of the 6 of us who left that conference and ended up having COVID was actually from California too, a good friend of mine, someone I've known a long time, from California. But I think there had been probably because we had done so much planning within the parish, with our bishop, with the diocese around, okay, if this is COVID, what's our response going to be? That when I finally got the diagnosis, which by the way was also the day the health department emailed me and told me it was fine for me to be out in public. And it didn't make any sense then. It makes sense now with what we know about when you encounter someone, when you're, get infected, when you're sick, when you're feeling better. So all of that made sense, but it was a bizarre thing to get on the same day for them to call me in the morning, say, yeah, it's COVID. That afternoon, get an email saying, oh, you're free to be in public. But we had focused so much on how many, the number of people and places that we needed to notify folks, that we sort of almost, I think I was prepared for it. And it was scary. It was very scary because, again, we heard about people getting sick in China and really not knowing a lot about it. I fortunately was not hospitalized. There was one night where my wife was out of town. I almost did get, I was like up and thinking, I'm going to go to the ER. I'm just not feeling great. And I didn't. And then fortunately got better, but it was scary. I mean, I had a wedding rehearsal. I had a wedding. I had prayed at the Chattanooga Bar Association memorial service. Every judge and lawyer in town. It was Bring Your Clergy Person to Rotary Day. I had been at that. I had been, Ash Wednesday had fallen in that. Our first Thorne Sparkman, our community event that we offer to the community during the season of Lent. All of these places, I'd sat next to a parishioner who, a young child who has diabetes. I mean, all of these things rush through you about, have I made other people sick? And thankfully, the only person that we identified as most likely being becoming positive with COVID from me was my wife, who fortunately was asymptomatic. So don't know if there were other people, not that we know of. So it was scary. Mostly, I think most of my anxiety was around other people and have I made someone else sick? I mean, as those of us who are in this business, we're around folks all the time, and we're the caregivers, and that sense of bringing that sort of an illness or pain to others is probably one of the worst things that we struggle with or would feel. And
so that brings up something that I haven't even put in my notes as I've talked to both of you in the past, and that's the idea of guilt associated with this pandemic. That in ministry we're dealing with people. For example, if they catch it and then someone else catches it and dies, what kind of a guilt must people have? Have either of you had experience with people that have had that and had that guilt in their life? Kayla?
That particular experience with guilt, I did not come across so much. The kind of guilt that I was encountering all the time in our community was when folks in our community did not have COVID, but they were still going through something significant, like a tragic loss, or they were going through cancer treatment, or they were isolated and lonely and having trouble with their mental health. They thought to themselves, well, if I don't have COVID, therefore I don't deserve anyone's attention. I don't deserve my rabbi's attention. Like, why? I can't call up and ask for they're so busy. They're attending to this health crisis that's, ravaging its way across the world. Like, how could they possibly pay attention to me? And what I needed to tell my people again and again is, no, you need to still tell us that what you're going through. We want to be there with you too, all the more so during this time. Even if you do not have COVID, even if you are not dying in your hospital bed right now, you also are suffering the consequences of separation, of whatever, if you have diabetes. I mean, you are twice as vulnerable. And so that was more the guilt that I was working with among my community to try to help them get out of thinking that they didn't deserve love or attention because they, didn't have the most extreme, they didn't have the disease of the moment.
And I think I should mention that this is your community, the ECAR community in Los Angeles, which was a 1,000-member synagogue, wasn't it? a conservative synagogue there. And from looking at the website, a very innovative one in reaching out and helping to revitalize spirituality of people that maybe hadn't been involved before.
Yes.
The situation, and Brad, maybe you can comment on this as well, because this is something that I've wondered about. Our conference is about inequity as well as faith. And we have inequities, obviously, in access to treatment among many different communities. And I hope that Bishop Kevin Adams can come on so that we can discuss that more from his perspective at Olivet Baptist Church as well. But one of the inequities is simply the people that have other diseases like cancer or diabetic situations or any kind of a surgery. Let's say you need hip surgery or knee surgery and you feel like, oh, I can't do that because somehow I'm taking resources. Is that something that you've run into, Brad?
Certainly, as a member of the community, I have. Fortunate, I have great healthcare. I have great access to healthcare. And I am keenly aware that that is not the case for everyone. And as a member of a community, we need to be aware of these things, and we need to be aware of those who are not, so that we can not only just be aware of it, but they will actually do something about it. And as I said, and Doug, we talked about something. I don't remember what interview or where I said it, but that COVID, of course, did not invent racism and separations, but it certainly has highlighted ways in which racism infiltrates our communities and our lives and our hearts. And it also exacerbated, I think in some cases has exacerbated it. I mean, you mentioned illnesses. All of those are illnesses that people deal with on a day-to-day basis, but then you throw COVID, of course, onto that, and they're even further at risk. So they're already communities and people who don't have access to good health care to address those issues of diabetes, cancer, high blood pressure, and then other things that are not health related, but impact their health, their income, their education, their access to education, all of that, and that COVID impacted all of that. I mean,
it even. Yeah, I'm sorry, but it even impacted things that we don't often think about. I know I've mentioned that my wife works at Advent Health Gordon in North Georgia in Calhoun, and many people that come in there, and that hospital was even mentioned on the national news. It had to bring in the National Guard. It had to get extra ventilators from FEMA. It had to enter into an agreement with the county to get county workers to come in and do non-medical procedures because they were close to the point of collapse. And many of the people that came in were people perhaps who were from various minority groups in the community. They didn't have access to housing that allowed them to quarantine within their home. When I got it, my wife and I could live in separate rooms. We had a house where we were able to do that, and she never caught it. But what if you're living in a place where several people are living in one room? How can you avoid catching it? And so there's just all of these inequities in the society where we don't have decent housing, or people who are overweight are much more at risk. And it's not just that they're going to catch it, it's the difficulty of the treatment plan of proning, where they move them back and forth in the hospital. And if you're doing that with someone that's overweight, it's very difficult for them and the staff, and their treatment is affected in a negative fashion because we haven't helped them to a better way. So,
and the employment, the jobs that people have. I mean, there are people whose jobs they can't work from home. I mean, and those people, many of those people, so it supports all of us. It supports our culture. It supports, people who drive trucks, people who do all of the things that require you to be in your place of business. All of those folks were at risk, and I have never experienced in my 60 years of life, never experienced a common event that has impacted in so many different ways and at so many levels. And I think that a year and a half into it, and almost 2 years into it, we're still, some of this is still fresh and figuring this out, and the impact on kids and schools, and not just young children, but college students, and what the impact of isolation and online stuff was. There's a whole lot we're going to look back on, and I think hopefully learn from going forward.
In a sense, and I'll ask you both to perhaps comment on this. This is a 9/11 event that we don't even have any idea of how it will change radically, permanently, the way in which each of us lives our life. And I'm wondering what changes you see that might be permanent, that in ministry we'd have to deal with. Whichever one of you wants to take a shot at that first.
Well, I mean, I'll just start by saying that obviously there's a number of changes, in the way that we'll live and move through the world and be in community that are very challenging and hard to deal with. Fear of death, fear of being together, even though being together is what could ultimately, be the key to so much healing spiritually. There's so many challenges now with how we're just going to have to live in our world. But I want to also bring up some of the great gifts that have come out of this time. I was mentioning to you earlier, Doug, that one of the things that started to happen in our community years ago, pre-COVID, PC, as some people say, or BC, before COVID, we had wanted to cultivate small group community, like sub communities within our greater community. And we originally years ago called them pods, and we wanted to arrange them by geography or by interest, or by demographics. And the idea was, because our community, just like Los Angeles, everyone lives pretty far flung from one another. So some people couldn't come for Shabbat services as often, and so they didn't see each other as much. Anyway, it had always been our dream to kind of cultivate these smaller communities, these little satellite communities that could still gather with one another. And then all of a sudden in COVID, that became, necessary. It became absolutely necessary to cultivate those little small communities, because if we wanted to gather for services, if people didn't want to be completely alone, we started having these little we called them watch parties, where we had the central service happening, and only a limited number of people could actually be there in person. But for people who wanted to Zoom into the service but not do that alone, and it was safe to gather in small numbers, all of a sudden people were having these little backyard gatherings. And for the first time, they were getting to know people in their neighborhood who were part of the community, and all of a sudden connecting in a new way. Their kids were connecting. And you both know just how much it means to know that there's other families who share values with you that you can call on in time of need or when you want to celebrate. And so one of the great things I think that will emerge from this time is, one, the acknowledgement of how important community is for us, which is really countercultural these days. I would say in American society, it's very individualistic and it's not community oriented. So number one, just the fact that community is so important for literally our survival and also our spiritual survival, but that we don't need a preacher to help us to gather and to, find strength and find support. We actually have our neighbors nearby, and there's a way of connecting to one another. And when someone's sick, we can drop something off because I now know that you exist and you're a block away. So that is one of the things that, one of the small but also mighty impacts of this time that I hope will actually live on well beyond this health crisis.
As you're talking, I'm remembering when I was a pastor, and I thought at times that I was running a concert hall or a country club, because people would just come, and I had a unique situation of a good sized congregation in a small town. People lived close by and they would come to everything. So we would have a concert on a Saturday night at the church and have 400 or 500 people show up to the concert. And of course, COVID has maybe done a service for us in making people realize what you're saying is that we need that connection where we're not just sitting in a pew listening to a preacher or listening to a musician, where we're actually getting messy and active. And, I'm thinking of Exodus 17, where Moses basically was trying to manage the whole camp by himself, and his father-in-law came along and said, "You're killing yourself," in colloquial terms, and all of Israel was divided up into what? Groups of 10 and 50 and so on. It's dangerous sometimes to tell a story without the text in front of me, but basically it was the way that it saved Israel at that time. And Brad, you've mentioned as well a quote that I like. It will teach us something about how we do connect, that is the pandemic. Being as intentional about connecting with one another as we've been intentional about disconnecting. So in other words, what I'm hearing you say there is the fact that we've had to be intentional about disconnecting, but that's taught us that we have to be just as intentional. What are some of the new ways that you're connecting in your church, and some of the ways that you think will be permanent ways that we can connect and create this culture that Kayla's been talking about of people individually looking out for each other?
Yeah, I think Kayla's right on target with our experience too, in that having to initially figure it out. Okay, well, we can do Zoom and we can do this. Moved us really quickly into that's important, and we want to thank God for the technology and our capacity to use it and the science that brought it all about. But at the end of the day, that can't 100% substitute human connection. And I think it I agree with her that it did highlight the need for that. And there's some things that as you all have both just referred to, that have been tried and true and are not, we don't have to reinvent that. In some cases, we were doing what we were calling front porch visits, and then everybody didn't always have a front porch. They had a back porch, or they had, the lawn to sit in. And we just put it out there. Hey, Brad will come by and do a front porch visit, wants to connect with you. Again, this was a year ago summer. So it was when we were really just started, kind of been hard lockdown, starting to come out. And I think there was this almost starvation. I don't want to be too dramatic, but a real desire to connect, having been through the technology aspect of it. And it was, the tap just flowed. People were calling, yes, want that. And I think I did over 45 of those in a 2-month period. And that connection. Decades ago, that's what, and still do, clergy still do those visits, but at least the circle of folks that I run with, it's not the same. It's not the same I can remember when I was a kid, and the past just kind of show up, I do that now. People are like, what are you doing here? Why, what's going on? What's wrong?
Or you can't get in the building downtown with all these new condos. My daughter lives in one, and I think that's been the struggle, that we all want to do that kind of pastoral visitation, and maybe the pandemic has created a need for it that allows us to do that. Now, I had the privilege of listening to a short sermon, and Brad, I'm going to get to your sermons. I had the privilege of talking with you and reading all the articles about you, but Kayla, you preached a sermon back April 3 of this year, and that's significant because this was during Passover time. If I remember correctly, it was the 7th day of Passover, where you celebrate coming out of Egypt, crossing over the Red Sea. And you mentioned something in there that really impressed me, because in the class that I am one of the teachers of in our church, we're studying Deuteronomy right now, and we're going through Moses recounting the history to his people, at the end of the 40 years in the wilderness. You said it was just a few days from Egypt to Canaan, or Canaan, as you put it there, for them to go, but they didn't go that way. So what did you say, and how did you connect this with our pandemic today? Because their Exodus experience turned out to be longer than they expected, and we're looking for an Exodus for freedom from this lockdown that we have here.
Thank you for listening to that. I'm really honored that you gave that a listen. And speaking of, COVID.
And the good news is that I spent 16 years listening to student sermons. So I just want to say I really, really appreciated the way that you went through the story and told the story. And as somebody who still struggles with Zoom, doing it on Zoom was even more impressive.
Thank you.
So they can go to ecar.org, right, to listen to it. Anybody that wants to hear that.
Yes, if you'd like to do that. Yes. I mean, I think we preachers had to get very good at staring at the green dot. It's a whole different skill set we had to learn in this past year, and I am not a computer person. Yes, so it was the 7th day of Passover, and I wanted to highlight the fact that, yes, it says, just after the Israelites have, made it out of 400 years of slavery and degradation, and they've made it across the Yam Suf, the Red Sea, and the waves have crashed down behind them, and Miriam takes up her timbrel, and they begin to dance. I think about that moment of celebration and of making it to the other side as kind of akin to what we're dreaming about when we dream about COVID being over. And I remember in April 2021, we were still not at the point where Delta was really a thing yet. And of course, those of us who were, listening to the news, watching the news, knew that COVID was not over. We knew that this would be going on, and in some form or another, and yet still there were some exciting kind of hurdles we had really crossed. We had vaccinations, we were starting to see a significant impact in society, and it looked like, particularly for our congregation, we were going to be able to get off Zoom and come together for the first time. And people were giddy for that moment in the same way, the Israelites must have been giddy when they finally got out. And what I wanted to emphasize is that it does say in the Torah, it says in Exodus, that God specifically didn't take the Israelites on the short route. They could have just very quickly, in a matter of 3 days, gone, just up the coast into Canaan from Egypt, but it specifically says that God leads them on a circuitous route through the wilderness, which will end up taking 40 years because of course, I have my 5-year-old here homesick today. And so I'll get her a snack in a minute. 1 minute. Okay. I'll get you a snack in a minute.
Yeah, and this is just part of COVID that we're learning to deal with as well, is the fact that I think, just to interrupt for a moment, maybe it brings a reality to life that was missing as we tried to put on a show before. And now we're living in a world where we're willing to be maybe more real with others.
Yes, I remember feeling, on the one hand, there's such a distance, there's such a barrier between us when we're meeting computer to computer. And on the other hand, you're seeing my world and my life and my existence in a way, you never would have known before. You're seeing, that I have to be a mother and I have to grab the, Cheerios for my daughter. So there is actually a strange kind of intimacy in meeting in these times. So anyway, God specifically chooses to bring the Israelites on a long circuitous route. And the rabbis have a lot to say about why God would have done this. Many of the rabbis say, well, the Israelites weren't ready. They had been freed from Egypt, but they didn't yet know what it meant to be a liberated person. So to be a liberated people. And so God actually specifically chooses to take them on a longer route, to take them to Mount Sinai, to give them the laws, to give them to the Torah, so that they can be prepared to learn how to create a just society in the land of Canaan, in the promised land. It's kind of a spiritual boot camp that they go through as they wander their way through the wilderness. That's one very common commentary. But when I was bringing it that day, I wanted to point out that just as the Israelites, even after they got to the other side of the Red Sea, and triumphed and celebrated for a moment with Miriam and singing and dancing. And we have to do that when we reach these milestones in COVID, when we get to the point where we can gather in 10 people, or we can gather, without masks outside, or, oh, we can finally sing together. When we reach those moments, we have to celebrate that. But what we also have to do is we have to remember all the loss that occurred previously. One of the things that the Israelites are told to do is, in addition to bringing their instruments, they have to bring the bones of Jacob to bury them in the land of Canaan. They have to bring the bones of their ancestors, which is to say, we have to acknowledge who came before us and who was lost during this time. We can't just be blind to all the loss that we've just, that we've been encountering and will continue to encounter. That's one. And then two is that this is a long, circuitous route, and we don't know where the end is. We just, in the same way that the Israelites didn't know where the promised land was, God was going to show it to them. And, the way the Torah goes is it's like this receding horizon, because even when in the Jewish tradition, when we get to the end of the Torah, when we get to the moment where they're literally on the verge of the promised land, they're about to get there, the book ends, and we start the whole thing over. And there's a point to that. There's the point to constantly being in a posture, in a state of seeking and moving forward and learning together and wandering a little bit blindly through the wilderness, working to have faith in the one that's kind of guiding you, but never quite reaching it, but constantly hoping we can reach it. And I wanted to remind my community of this, because that's the reality of where we are now. And while of course it's disappointing that we all had to remask and we had to re-separate during Delta, my kids were suddenly home from school again, and I was doing Zoom school again. I was like, what? No, that was back there. That's supposed to be over. That we need to strengthen ourselves spiritually and to acknowledge that, we're still in the wilderness and we're going to keep on moving there. And as long as we stick together, we can still make it.
I really appreciate that. And Brad, I want to focus in on one of the things that Kayla mentioned there, and that is the bones of Joseph being brought by Moses back. And of course, Joseph had asked them to do that when they were delivered. The sense of remembering people. How have you been doing that in your church, as I know you've dealt with multiple funerals? You mentioned one family where both the husband and the wife died, and the tragedies of this. How have you been keeping those people in memory, and how do we maintain or create new death rituals when we can't do the old ones?
Yeah, so right, a lot of those burial services we held, and even if we did do graveside burials, we held memorial services, months later when people could gather, and some still have yet to do. And people evolve. Their grief may change in a way that what they thought they would need to do months ago, they may shift to do it a different way. So some of those we've redone. We are actually, and our good friend Wyatt Massey, I see him in as an attendee on this, and Wyatt has, with the Free Press, has done some really great coverage throughout this, and I just want to publicly thank him for that, and put a little plug for you, Wyatt. I know that we've sent this out, but next on the 7th, we're going to do a Requiem Mass around All Saints, and with a particular intention for those who have died during COVID. And we'll certainly remember folks from St. Paul's, but it's a communal offering to the community, and one in which we will celebrate that. And I know different communities do this in different ways, tolling of bells and all, and just I think whatever ways the Spirit is speaking to the community at the time, And that's one of the things we're going to be doing because what is so important to our particular community at St. Paul's is an expression in music of our thankfulness to God and our grief to God and all of the emotions that we have, that now that we can do that in sort of a full sense, encouraging people to be vaccinated and masked when they're present, that we're able to do that in the way in which we really kind of live into it at St. Paul's with music. And so I'm looking forward to that, and it for everybody who experiences worship in whatever format, the importance of music coming into that, and it's an act of prayer. So we're looking forward to that. That's again, I think it's the 7th. It's that Sunday, and I believe it's at 4:00 or something like that. It'll be on our website. Yes, 4:00. So that's a significant one. That's one that we've been planning doing a lot of. But in addition to that, Doug, the funerals that we had to put on hold and for folks, and as I said, we've caught up to most of those. I think we may have a couple that are still out there, and people are trying to decide what they want to do. But those, and all of us who are people of faith, that ritualistic aspect is so important, and especially in a culture, I think our culture in America wants to remove us from that. They want to keep us from feeling the pain of a loss, and we're told, oh, don't cry, it's going to be okay. Well, for crying out loud, it's not okay.
Right.
I just lost my mom and dad. I just lost my sister. I just lost my best friend. It's not okay.
Yeah.
Now our big message is, yes, it will be okay. We're going to get to the place, but my goodness, we do so much to try and cut ourselves off from that pain, that maybe this is one of those many things that we're going to learn in COVID of it's important to grab hold and to live into that grief and pain and loss, and maybe find some ways that we bring that back into an expression that is helpful for people in moving that journey.
I think in the Christian context, in John 11, when Jesus was confronted with the death of his best friend Lazarus, he wept. Mm-hmm. That was the first thing that was his response. And then he said, show me the grave. And Martha says, when they get ready and he wants to open the grave, she says, no, he stinks. He's been in there for 4 days. So Jesus didn't shrink back from those realities of death. And I think that that's something for me. I know I went to Maine in June to speak at a memorial service for the husband of one of my cousins. This was a man that had spent 52 years in the same community, 50 years actively as a physician. And there was this desperate need in the family and in the whole community. And at that time, there was a lull and there weren't a lot, so people came appropriately masked, but the church was packed with people from many different faith communities, and there was some closure that was there for the son, to 2 sons who were great musicians, to perform. For me, who was carrying the Bible for the preacher in his wedding when I was 6 years old, to actually speak at his funeral, that was closure for me as well. And I don't know that we've spoken a lot, but we need to talk a little bit about the fact of the caregivers and the first line responders who need ministry as well in this time. So I always wanted a funeral rather than a memorial service. But I'm realizing that what we're doing is we're radically changing our customs. And as we do this, we still have to provide that closure, even if it is 3 months later, or some time like that. One of the things that I've also felt, Kayla, you've worked with particular Jewish customs about burial, and maybe you could just briefly describe those and how those have had to change in COVID and how we can create meaningful customs there.
Yeah, sure. So Jewish customs around grief and burial are very powerful and helpful for people who are mourning and people who are dying, because there's really, like so much else in Jewish tradition, there's a very specific order to things. And also what is so powerful about Jewish death rituals is they're very direct. They are in person, they are not virtual. And that's part of what made this time so challenging for our community. It is the tradition that when someone dies, first of all, they need to be buried as soon as possible, returning their body to the ground. And as soon as possible, we're told in the Torah to do this, and we want to return them to the earth. That they also were not meant to leave them alone. There's a legend among the rabbis, a midrash that says that the soul of a person after they've died actually hovers near the body for 3 days, kind of confused, because normally the idea of the rabbis, remember this is centuries ago, but the thought was that whenever you went to sleep, it was like a partial death, and your soul would actually leave while you were sleeping and go spend time with other souls and with God. And then in the morning, your soul would return to you. And so the first words that are meant to be on your lips in the morning is Moda ani lefanecha melachai v'kayam shechazarta binishbati b'chemla rabba emunatecha. Sorry for all the Hebrew, but essentially, thank you, God, for returning my soul to me and letting me live another day. And so after the body has died, after a person has died, the soul thinks, well, shouldn't I be returning to the body? But then comes and sees the expression on the face and realizes something is wrong. And so the tradition is that we're actually supposed to guard and accompany the soul of the deceased, that they should never be left alone, to offer comfort to the soul, to let them know, don't worry, we're going to bury your body so that you can go and return and be with God and, be part of God's breath again and be part of it all. And so that's in person. And then we are commanded to physically bury our loved ones, we ritually wash the body in a process called tahara, and then we dress the body in shrouds, we lay the body in the coffin. The mourners themselves aren't doing this, but there's a special group of people, a burial society, which does that ritual. And then the family themselves, once the person has been lowered into the earth, into the ground, the family and whoever is in attendance is meant to take earth and put it directly onto the grave. And to even shovel dirt, and ideally to fill it to the top. We ourselves are meant, that is, we are told, is one of the greatest acts of kindness one can do for a person, because you can't be thanked for it. The person can't thank you. And it's also one of the greatest acts of kindness. It's one of the things that God did for Moses. God buried Moses. And so in imitation of God, to be like God, we too bury our loved ones. And so all of these acts are direct and in person. And it's so important for closure. Psychologists today would say, well, that's so important, to actually witness the burial, even though it's heart-wrenching and so painful to lay earth on the casket of your loved one. It allows you to actually begin to say goodbye and begin to actually understand that this person is no longer alive, walking the earth with you. And so suddenly not being able to do tahara, many of our Chevra Kadisha, our Jewish burial societies, couldn't go to mortuaries because they were overrun and it was not safe, and you could still get COVID from a dead body. They couldn't do tahara. Shmirah, which is the mitzvah of accompanying this deceased, was no longer available. And physically burying, in most cases, being there for the physical burial was also not an option, especially in the early days. And so, and then finally, I haven't mentioned, after the funeral, Jews gather together at the mourner's home for a tradition called Shiva for the first 7 days after a person has died, to offer consolation to the mourners. the mourner is sitting low to the ground in an act of mourning, and we feed them meals of consolation, and we are there physically visiting them. One more case in which we just couldn't do those things. And so attending to mourners during this time has been probably, some of the most important work. Learning how to do Shiva online, learning how to make sure family members can access the Zoom, to make sure they know how to speak to one another, to create a sense of togetherness for the mourners. In a case where there were several people who couldn't physically be at their loved one's burial. And so I tried to figure out other things they could do in the absence of, of their family. What could they do? There was one man in particular for whom it was so painful that he couldn't physically bury his mother. He just couldn't travel because it wasn't safe at the time. And so we talked about how he could actually plant a lemon tree in his backyard, because it involved earth, it involved laying something, but it also involved planting something that would grow in her memory. And we ended up doing a lot of singing and saying prayers together online and over the phone. And also during our Shabbat services, making sure, this was so important. We always have a place that, a memorial prayer in the middle of our service and at the end of our service. It's called the Mourner's Kaddish, when mourners stand and they recite a prayer. But in those moments, we used to go around and collect the names of people's deceased loved ones in person. So on Zoom now, now we make sure to say those names aloud. We receive the names and then we say the names and acknowledge each person and the person that they've lost, and making sure, and just saying the names and then hearing the name of your loved one being spoken after they've died, 6 months ago, 9 months ago. That was so powerful for people. Even if they, couldn't be with their community, they at least could hear their loved one's name be mentioned, and to know that the community was praying that this person's memory would be a blessing.
I really appreciate that. And I notice that one of the pastors of my church, Melody Wallace, who's a new pastor for Visitation and has been a faith community nurse and has that type of training, that she's on this call. And in our church, what they started doing several years ago that I think is very similar is there's a service at the end of the year. There is an evening service of remembrance of all the members who have died in the past year. And it's a message with a message from one of the pastors. There's music, and each person is invited to come up and to light a candle that's there for the name of each person. And then there's an opportunity to remember the names and for others in the community to speak out and to share something about it. And I found that much more healing than I had anticipated. When I've gone with friends or people that I haven't been able to really mourn in a proper way. I want to switch to another subject now, because there's the whole area of inequity. And I mentioned that in the class that I teach, we're studying Deuteronomy. And this week, our study is on Deuteronomy 10:19, where it says, "Love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt." And it also goes to where Jesus quoted from the Shema and from the text in Leviticus, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And I basically am looking at this and wondering, Brad, you've talked about the fractures in society. And I know one of the things that you've done is you've worked with Olivet Baptist Church and other churches in the community to try to heal some of these fractures that are in the community, where we somehow in our Christian world today, we've forgotten that the alien, the stranger, the widows, the children that are orphans are all in both the Old and the New Testament are people that the Bible says we have to look after in a very special way. how do we get back to where the Christian world really is willing to see the alien in biblical terms rather than in the sense of, oh, these people that we need to deport and whip and somehow deal with in a negative way?
Boy, that's a big question. And I think I know so many great colleagues who are across all faith lines who are really working on that and have great angst about it. At St. Paul's, we did several years ago, driven by probably 36 folks who wanted to recapture. We've had a long history of being involved with social action, social justice at St. Paul's. Sometimes we do that really well. Sometimes we remember that we did it really well, and we're not always on our best in that. And so, because it's in our DNA, we do get that reminder, and hopefully are guided in a way that we can take action. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a group of folks who wanted to do that and said, we don't want to come up with a new program. We don't want to go in and fix a community. That's not what this is about. We don't think that's not only is that not effective, we don't think that really is what God's calling us to. And what they wanted to do was connect with people who were different from ourselves. But yet acknowledging we are the same. We are created by God in the image of God, and that's what we wanted to celebrate. So we, through some mutual friends and connections, we did connect with Olivet and St. Paul AME, and began to have monthly meetings of folks who would come together for the sole purpose of building relationships and recognizing, naming, honoring differences, but also what we had in common. And so that when we were to face issues that really were ramped up and had great significance, then we already had these relationships. We didn't have to go out and figure them out. And we could call on one another, and the zip codes that in this, and we've got two zip codes, I think, that are 598th and 599th worst for health outcomes in the state, right in Chattanooga. And those are primarily zip codes of people of color. And as we as a community have to recognize the inequity in that, and to try and do something about that, whether it's influencing those who are in political positions of political power and authority, or partnering with people and saying, what can we do? We're a partner with you. Tell us how we can be of service and help. And because, we're one people and called to be that way. And for me, that's a faith statement, and not so much a community or a city or a statement, but a faith statement that we really are created in the image of God, all of us. And so I think this is just, as we started out, I think earlier on, it's highlighted some of these extreme differences. And I mean, to be real blunt, I think, most of our politics these days is about, how we're different from one another. And I know that I'm tired of it, and I know that other pastors and other leaders are tired of it, and looking for solutions around it, and looking for ways to not focus on so much what divides us, unless those things are immoral and unjust, but look for what binds us together, and let that be the guiding force that moves us into a higher morality, into issues of justice for everyone. I often feel inadequate in regards to answers to that, other than I know that it's, as someone who experiences a great deal of privilege in this country, it's important for me to be connected with people who don't have that life experience, and to be a listener and a follower of those.
I really appreciate that. And I'm thinking, and I see Greg is back with us again. Did you have something you wanted to add to this, Greg? Okay. I know that that Greg Phelps is an expert in the area of, as a physician working in hospice settings, with the problems that older people face often in this situation. We're looking at the problems of, as you mentioned, African Americans dealing with reduced access to healthcare, reduced access to financial resources that others have. And I'm thinking in my wife's setting in Calhoun, Georgia, there's many people that are of Hispanic origin who basically have a lack of access to many things that we take for granted because of our position. And I'm thinking in the Bible, in both the Torah and in the New Testament, there is this sense, as Jesus put it, inasmuch as you've done it unto one of the least of these, you've done it to me. There is that culture that we have that somehow we've forgotten. And I'm wondering, and Brad, I'm going to come back to you on this question, whether the church growth movement in the 70s and 80s and books, pivotal books, like I think it was Peter Wagner, I'm speaking off the cuff here, People Like Us, where basically they said, in order to grow a church, you want to grow a church based on people who look like you and not on a multicultural model. And so basically we began to look and say, well, we need to worship with people that are like us. We got this church over here and all these people are like this, and this church over here. And we don't even come together anymore and learn to live in the messy real world where different cultures have to learn to coexist and to help each other.
Yeah, the shadow side of my tradition is the saying is that in regards to evangelism, Episcopalians sort of they figure anybody who wants to be an Episcopalian already is one. So why go and share that? I think you're right. I think it became, that focus became about self-sustaining and a fear of losing something or closures. And I happen to think that it's important that people have different worshiping communities that reflect, Kyla, you said it earlier, one's values and the place that is at the center of you. And that's okay, and that we recognize that we live outside of that. We live in the world day to day with one another, and that our call really is more about how is God calling us in my case? How is God calling me to live in the world Monday through Saturday and being present and living sacrificially for others. Recognizing that the world doesn't revolve around me, and respecting and celebrating the differences that others may have, assuming we're all in that together. We're all driven to that. Now, there are certainly faith traditions from the Christian perspective that are more interested in them and us and separating and judgment, and that's not a reflection of my understanding of faith from a Christian tradition, and it's painful when to see that, but I really I think just celebrating who we are and the places where we gather and how that sends us out into the world to live with one another.
Yeah, Kayla, I want you to pick up on this, because as I read about ICAR on the website, the synagogue that you were associated with, there was a term there that was interesting to me, because you said multi-denominational. And at first I thought, well, is that Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu? But you're talking about multi-denominational in the sense that you were welcoming people of various viewpoints within Judaism, is what I assume there. How did you work with dealing with various groups in that congregation in LA, where everybody you look at looks like they're from a different part of the world?
Well, I am of the belief, and I think the leaders of the community of ICAR are of the belief that a community is stronger when it's more diverse and when it represents more diverse voices. And we're not interested in being, all the same. We're interested in learning from those of us who are different. And in terms of, so multi-denominational, what that means is, I talked about Orthodox, conservative and Reform Judaism before. What it basically means to be multi-denominational in the Jewish sense is to say, if you're Orthodox, if you're Reform, if you're Reconstructionist, if you're Renewal, whatever kind of Jew you are welcome here. And by the way, if your spouse isn't Jewish, they're welcome here too. And the idea is we wanted our tent to be really big when it came to Jewish practice and Jewish knowledge. A lot of Jews will just not feel comfortable going into a Jewish space or a ritual Jewish space because they feel like, oh, I don't know enough, and are worried that they might do something wrong in the prayer service or something like that. And we wanted to make it really clear that you are welcome here, even if you don't even know, if you don't know Hebrew, you're still welcome here. Or if you're Orthodox and if it's really important. So we kind of strike this beautiful balance. On the one hand, we are in practice basically a conservative community in terms of our prayer life, and in terms of our practice, we actually are more traditional. We pray mostly in Hebrew, though the clergy offers a lot of explanations in English. So people know what's going on. And then we make the music really compelling and easy to sing along with so that people can feel like they can participate. But we didn't want those who are Reform or those who are conservative to have to be in separate communities. We wanted to let them come together and to celebrate with one another and mourn with one another. So that's what it means in terms of multi-denominational Jewish community. But it was also really important at ICAR and continues to be really important at ICAR. Oh, I still need to get you a snack. I will get you a snack after I finish this last thing. I forgot. We want to make sure that we're also racially diverse and representative. And one of the ways that we tried to begin to address the huge problem of inequity specifically in Los Angeles, and then also in the country, is we partner with Black churches in Los Angeles and make sure to have multi-faith partnerships in the community and remain in constant dialogue with other faith leaders. But also within the Jewish community, it's incredibly racially diverse. People don't know this, and even Jews don't know that there are Black Jews and there are Asian Jews and there are Jews from India. And people forget this. And so what we did is we actually wanted to look internally, and we looked at like who's sitting at the table. When we look at our board, like, is it all, is it mostly white men? Is it mostly white women? Who's sitting here? Who has a say here? And let's make sure that people sitting at this table are representative of the full fledged, colorful, multiple ideas kind of community that we want to have. So any position of leadership on our board, on our clergy, lay leaders, we wanted to make sure that Black and Brown and Latinx and Asian folks were also part of those leadership roles, so that when a Black Jew walks into the community and they don't feel like, oh gosh, I'm the only one. Like, yes, there are going to be more, more of a sea of white faces, but oh, I see that, this guy who's on the board looks like me. And so I feel like I can belong here too. And so a huge part of our work in terms of addressing inequity in our local society was looking at our community itself, and then also making it a priority to learn about how we can address inequity on a political level in local, in the way local decisions are made around homelessness, healthcare, education, housing.
I'm going to let you go and help your daughter while I ask Brad a question.
I'll be right back.
And Brad, one of the things that as I look at all of this, and we deal with these issues, is vaccine hesitancy and vaccine. What is the term that I really want to use here? Opposition may be as neutral a term as well. And I noticed where, ministry happens, and we're sorry that Kevin Adams could not be with us today. But we recognize that if you're a ministry leader, you've got to be where the ministry is. I noticed on his church website at Olivet Baptist that there's a wonderful section on COVID, and it gives all the facts, and it gives all of the questions and everything and the answers. And of course, with Mary Lambert there, who spoke earlier at this conference, he certainly has some of the most expert opinion anywhere. How have you dealt with that issue in your church? And I'm going to be very honest in saying that my pastor, Dave Ferguson, has been a person that I've admired because, he has a very large church. There's multiple pastors on the staff. There's multiple lay leaders in the church and many different programs, but there's been all kinds of ideas about what we should do. And it's difficult. And I think for those that are online listening here, it's really difficult as a leader in times of crisis. How do we bring people along without alienating them toward a position that we feel is biblical and scientific at the same time?
Yeah, we were in some ways, I think, very lucky in this, and the way in which we tend to do theology absolutely takes into the gift of experience and intellect and reason and rationality, and all of that feeds, of course, down the road of science and things that can be proven, the way in which we develop hypotheses and take new information. Okay, we need to pivot. For example, the CDC early on, really wasn't emphasizing masks, and then it pivoted, and people have used that as a criticism, like, well, they changed their mind. Well, they learned new things. The medical community learns new things. That's how science works, is we experience and I'm not speaking as a scientist, but that we learn new things and we pivot and we move forward. So the way in which we do theology and approach the world naturally brings that into our collective way of thinking. So when we turn to the CDC and we point to the CDC as a primary source of information, to our own health, our own Hamilton County Health Department as a primary source of education, that we're not asking people to go and sit on their back porch and do their own research of Google and find out what they should do. I mean, we've got folks who feed who participate in our daily lives on a regular basis, who do this work. So we certainly from the very beginning were transparent and worked with the health department in regards to notification of things where I had been. So it sort of started because of that. It just exploded into how we also communicated with our parish and how we were going to do things. I think that in some way that helped us. It sort of set the precedent, set the bar high of we're going to follow science on this. And in some ways, we were.
I'm just
careful.
Sorry, but in one thing, the fact that you were the first case, they knew somebody that had it right away. And for a lot of people, they didn't know somebody for a long time. It was like, well, this isn't any worse than the flu because I don't know anybody.
Right.
So your church, I don't want to call that a blessing, but it was a situation where they could see the results there.
Yeah. It was, and we also made the decision to be transparent when we could be, when the press would. I got a lot of calls from the press early on to, every time something would happen, well, what do you think? I'm like, why are you asking? I don't know about that stuff. I know. And so, but we spun that in a way that we felt was helpful to the community, which was being open, honest, transparent, and following science. And at the same time, recognizing that there are those few cases where people may have a decision about a vaccine that is really unique to them and based on that. Our staff is 100% vaccinated. We without much fanfare, or we just said this is the way it's going to be. Our child care workers in our programs are 100% vaccinated. Not going to hire anybody who doesn't want to be vaccinated. And I'm not. That doesn't mean to be harsh. It's just that we believe that's the way to create the safest environment that we can in our space. And we still are being masked indoors when we're gathering, excuse me, for worship and other gatherings. We're still trying to practice social distancing as best we can, and certainly wearing masks. So following that was just crucial for us from the start, and we really didn't even entertain sort of the politicization of it and the arguing from that sort of perspective. It's like we weren't going to go there. We're just not going to do that. And if people, and we really had, I mean, I will have to say that we, thank goodness, my experience, and I know this is not everyone's, my experience was we just didn't have people who wanted to go that direction. And so I know that we were very fortunate in that regard, but and it, that is sort of frustrating when you see that played out in the community in ways that just don't make sense. And I can't take out of someone's head with reason what reason didn't put in it. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating. And I've had, I mean, I've buried folks because of decisions like that. Yeah, I've buried folks because of people not following, and I'm not saying our people, but because of sort of the chain of events, they end up getting sick, not because they chose to do something irresponsible or that just sort of denies science and medicine, but because someone else did, and someone else's policy. That is frustrating. That's unjust. That's poor leadership. That's a lot of things that faith communities should speak out about.
It's very interesting to me that people that are opposed to vaccine often are opposed at a level where they're willing to lose a job. They're willing in many ways to avoid that. And in my faith setting, I see both sides because obviously Advent Health is one of the largest hospital systems, religious systems in America, with very strong scientific foundation. And we've always had a doctrine of health and of well-being that's based upon science. As I mentioned, I think Tequila, I did a doctorate studying the relationship between health and spirituality. And it's interesting to me that in today's world, many Christians are looking to the Bible. And if you go back to the Mosaic health laws in the Torah, you find that isolation, you find that quarantine, you find that taking good cleanliness habits and keeping clean and all of that was a part of it, and was public health at a time when people didn't know that. Most of what keeps us healthy is not going to the doctor, but it's the public health principles upon which this country was built and on which the Old Testament was built. And I just lost everything.
We can still hear you. You're
there?
frozen. We can still hear you. Yeah.
What a terrible expression on my face there. But anyway, I'll try to take the camera off and see what happened. I just lost everything, blanked out on me. For what reason, I have no idea. I tell you what, I'm going to give you a question, and then I'm going to come back into this to get rid of things, because one question that I think, Brad, you and I had discussed before was the issue of when protocols interfere with pastoral care, how do we balance that? And I'll let you take a shot at it, and then let Kayla take a shot at it, and go from there. So I'm going to sign in and out of this, Greg, and because I'm frozen up here at home.
Sure. Well, first of all, we're involved enough and connected enough with hospitals that we know that they are making very large, broad decisions based on science and for the care of their patients and those who come into the building. So we always start with it. That's the premise, and respect those. Of course, there are times when a certain circumstance may call for something else, and so when folks are dying and we're called to do last rites, our families want to be with those folks. We understood hospitals' decisions around the number of people per room and all of those. So we sought ways to involve the entire family, whether it's a FaceTime, everybody else is in the parking lot, one person, of family choice in the room with us and making those and doing those prayers. There were ways to work around that. But there are times when, I think that I have certainly said, I know that's the rule, that's this guy, but I need to take this action and to maybe push a bit back on that. And I would never do that in a way that I felt was putting anyone else in harm or major disruption to an institution. I just know that large institutions sometimes have to make decisions that cover as many bases as they can, and then that there are those unique cases where, well, wait a minute, I think we can do this. And when approached reasonably, my sense is that administrators are always, as best they can, want to work with you. Sometimes they still have to hold the line that they do, and I totally respect and understand that. It's just trying to do best. They're trying to do their best for their folks. I'm trying to do best for my folks. Both of us hopefully taking into consideration the importance of science, caring for others, and not doing anything irresponsible. But yeah, sometimes those things clash, and I think we can just be respectful of one another and find a way to make something happen. And my experience is that people in the health communities here in Chattanooga respond really well to that and want to do the best that they can for people. A lot of respect for those folks. It's nothing in this is easy. Nothing is cut and dry and as I said, Doug, I think before, is anytime when it happens to my family, it's like it's the first time it's happened. And yeah. I get it. We get it. Why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't it? I mean, as empathetic and as caring as I can be for others when it's my family, I get it. I understand that. And that's when I really respect hospitals that have to do for the broader good in the face of that sort of pain and loss. That's been difficult to be in the midst of that and to help people walk through that.
Kayla, I'm glad I'm back. I'm glad I could get back online here. Go ahead.
Just keep a smile on your face the whole time, Doug, in case you freeze.
Yeah, that way I won't look the way I did on that.
Well, I will say that the ICAR, the community that I was working with that I was serving in Los Angeles, we were progressive in so many different ways, but something we said at the very beginning of the pandemic is this is where we're going to be actually very, very conservative. From the very beginning, the clergy, we all made it very clear that we are going to be following whatever protocols we're getting from. We created a medical task force, like so many other religious communities. We had physicians, like top physicians, kind of telling us the latest on what we needed to do to keep our community safe. And we were more conservative than most Jewish communities in our area. We gathered very carefully back when we started to be able to gather back again. We were probably one of the last communities to do that. One of the reasons being we don't actually have a building yet. And so we continued to be online, and we were surprised to, on the one hand, we have a very, we have a population of folks who believe in science and believe in vaccines and believe in, masking and social distancing. They believe in all of those protocols. And also they were so thirsty to be with one another. And they were looking around at the local Jewish communities and saying, well, they're gathering, with 10 or 20 people. Why can't we do that? And so, and in response to that, we just kept on having to say, look, our medical task force is telling us this is the safest way for us to gather. And for us, life is the most sacred gift we have, and we will do nothing to put anyone's life on the line, especially since there are so many in our community who are elderly or immunocompromised. We are just not gonna play with life. And so we made that really clear from the beginning. And of course, the big challenge was just constantly keeping the community abreast of our new policies. And it was a constant moving target of what we can do and what we can't do. And so to address the fact that there were so many times where we needed to pastor, we needed to be in touch. There were a couple of really tragic deaths in our community during COVID, not to COVID. There were other, they were different circumstances, but under normal circumstances, I would have been in the hospital room with this person, and I just couldn't be. And the person understood, but it was so painful. But what that meant is we doubled down on other kinds of connection. I was telling Doug earlier that we created this system where every single person in the community was assigned another person in the community to call and check in on regularly, so that everyone was at least getting a call or a check-in. We clergy tried to reach every single community member at one point or another with a little phone call, checking in just to see how you're doing. But, us four clergy trying to call 1,000 people and also addressing all the needs as they were going on was hard. So having community members care for one another in the meantime was really, really key. And then, working to, like, in the case of this person whose hospital room I should have been in praying with her, instead, I was with her husband and with her daughter on the steps outside the hospital, masked when I could. I got as close as I could possibly go. I called and I checked in, and we also held a virtual healing circle for the community who, everyone was thinking about.
We've got 1 minute, so I just want to, I'm sorry to.
This is I will end there. I think you get the point.
No, and I wish we had time to hear about wine and wine. And I'll just mention that it's WINE and WHINE, a group where young parents could come together to whine and take a little wine to mellow them out, I guess, about their whining. So anyway, that was a creative solution there. I just really want to thank each one of you and be sensitive to ending on time here. And I wish we could have brought in all of our other participants today. I know that we've had several online. Right now we have 16. And we want to thank each one of you that have been listening to this. And I want to close to honor the sermon I heard from Kevin Adams, yesterday's sermon, because he basically had a wonderful message. And I'm just getting back to my notes on that, where he basically was talking about a text in Ephesians where Paul says, "To him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is worked in us." And he talked about the next text, be glory in the church. And he said, each one of us has a glory inside of us from God that we need to recognize. And I think I'm thinking back to what you both have said, and the fact that we are not there yet. We're not to the end. But if we stop looking at COVID and we start looking at our spiritual foundation and the glory of God in our lives, that is something where we can rejoice. We can play the timbrel and dance. We can celebrate, even in the midst of loss, because we realize that we're alive. We realize that that God is still working in our various communities in special ways. So let's keep that in mind and recognize the glory that God has given to us, his power in our lives. And I just want to thank each one of you for being here today. Greg, I'm going to let you end this if you have anything to say.
Well, I was just in process of typing to say thank you so much for all the panelists for participating. And this concludes our Book of Life conference for this year.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
Doug,
to
for
all.
moderating.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you
Very good.
as well.
We'll leave it at that and let Greg take us off the air here.